Hello there. This is my first video in a series dedicated to one of my PhD research components. I want to make history of science. I want to create a historical account of this discipline, of this field of research called social ecology, but specifically as it developed in Vienna, in Austria. Now, social ecology is about studying the relationship between human systems and non-human systems, or natural systems. That obviously done with the goal of contributing to issues of sustainability around the world. But this sounds like a gigantic field of research, one that's happening all over the world. I mean, all over the world, there are people studying the relationship between humans and nature. All over the world, there's research being done to help solve issues of sustainability. So why focus in Austria? Well, that's because first, in the social ecology that's being done in Austria, researchers are not simply trying to observe how humans affect nature, they're really trying to push the conceptual boundaries and observe how humans are interrelated with all non-human systems. They're trying to erase that divide, that division, that binary between humans and nature. On the other hand, in Vienna, you also have one of the most cohesive, active, engaged, and also pretty influential communities doing this type of work. And on top of that, this community of researchers is also pretty aware of the fact that they're not simply trying to do new science, new research. They're aware of the fact that the work that they want to do is very interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary in nature, and therefore it is work that challenges the traditional norms and structures of scientific and academic work. But I'll leave it there. I won't say more about social ecology, and I won't say more about it because I really don't know much more about this, community of science. And precisely because what I want to do is to document my process of research and study from here, from the start, from the beginning. And I also want to let you be part of that. And so what I'm doing right now, documenting and sharing the process, this is not just a side quest, this is not just academic outreach. I want this to be a core part of my methodologies. But I'll explain more about that later. So to start, in this video, the question is, how can I set up a plan to put together, to develop a historical account of a field of science, of a field of research like social ecology? In other words, how do you make history, and specifically, how do you make history of science? And that is a big question and quite a difficult one. The major hurdle being absolutely everything can count as history. Everything that has happened, after all, is part of history. So what does that mean? Does that mean that when I try to study social ecology, every little single detail that I find, should I put in the database? Should I analyze? Should I triangulate? Should I scrutinize? Should I archive? Should I code? Well, no, of course no. That's unfeasible. That's impossible. So what I need is a proxy. I need a shortcut. So I need to look not at everything, but I need to pay attention to the major historical events in the history of social ecology. But now, which are those events? And what kind of events are those? And how do I find them? Well, of course, the answers to those questions depend on what you're making a history of. And in the case of a scientific field, of a scientific discipline, the first obvious answer is that, well, those are the scientific contributions, the scientific advancements, the discoveries. Now, that sounds pretty good, pretty sensible, but how do I find those major scientific contributions? And here there's something very important to take into consideration, that there are actually plenty of ways in which scientists make societal contributions. Sometimes scientists help shape policies, sometimes scientists work directly with certain communities and directly try to help them. So yes, there are many different ways in which scientists make their social contributions. Nonetheless, it seems like the quintessential one for science, for research, is the peer-reviewed journal publication. And thankfully, we have databases that gather them and that allows us to analyze them. Therefore, a very good, systematic, informative, data-rich, and easily quantifiable way of studying social ecology through its major scientific publications will be to do something that's called a scientometric analysis. That is, again, an analysis of scientific publications, looking also at some of the extra data, at the metadata in these studies, but mostly observing the connections between one study and others. The connections created through the ways in which they cite each other, they refer to each other. So if I want to put together something like a historical account of social ecology, what I can do is use the scientometric databases and methods and try to identify over time the most influential, the major publications in the scientific discipline. And obviously then I can see how they have evolved, how the major works have influenced each other. And now that will be awesome. That will indeed give me insight into how the methods, the assumptions, the questions, the tools, the theories, the answers, how all of this has evolved over time. But I am not going to do that. Now, one big reason why I'm not going to do that, but not the main one, is feasibility. I have already experimented and tried some of these methods. I have already tried to learn about them and learn how to use them. And to be fully honest, I don't think that I will be capable of really learning how to proficiently make use of them, at least not in a way that's rigorous enough in the limited amount of time that I have to complete my PhD. And most importantly, I don't think that I will enjoy the process that much. And that's because, and this is actually a major reason for me not to use those methods, there are too many important things that these methods, that these scientometric databases are not capable of seeing. And that's because an approach like this, mostly focused on scientific publications and how they cite each other, only tells you the most internal history of a scientific discipline. It only tells you how scientists communicated with each other in the very specific goal of trying to answer their very specific questions. What you get is the history of how a question and answers to that question have evolved. You don't really get the history of the group of people that is trying to answer a question. So you don't really get things like the socio-political context in which the research was done. You don't get much insight into the motivations that researchers had to do their job. You don't get much insight into how groups and collaborations came up together. You don't get much insight into the many challenges and problems that appear in the long process of trying to conduct a scientific study. And most importantly, and also kind of surprising, these methods really do not tell you how a study, how scientific research has had an influence or an impact in anything other than other scientific publications. It does not tell you how research has had an impact in the world. And those, of course, are very important things in any scientific discipline, but I think they are especially important in social ecology. And that's because, first, this is a scientific discipline that recognizes that it's trying to do something challenging, something different, something that pushes the boundaries of traditional ways of doing science. And therefore, we want to get insight into what that challenge to the institution of academia has looked like. And sometimes it's not even about direct challenges to the institution. Sometimes can be just the simple challenge of trying to bring together people from different disciplines, get them to understand each other, get them to work together. And second, of course, this is a field that pretty obviously is trying to bring solutions to social and environmental issues. And so obviously we want to know how the research actually impacted or contributed to sustainability. And so if I'm not using these databases of scientific publications, how will I put together this historical account of social ecology, especially if I still want to pay attention to its major contributions, its major scientific publications? Well, and the answer is that to do that, I can just ask people around. Science and research does not have to be impossibly complicated, but it has to be systematic and well organized and transparent. And so, to ask people around, we need to set up some basic methods. We need to set up some basic questions that I want to answer. And also I need to develop some good methods for organizing the information that I will gather through this process. Especially organize that information in a way that's accessible, that's easily understandable, that's traceable, that's transparent. Now, with that said, I have a little framework of questions, the research questions that I want to answer, and you can easily access that and comment on that if you like. Now, it is very basic, I know. As of now, it only tells you which are the sub-questions that I want to answer. Because, of course, I want to approach researchers in social ecology, I want to ask them what do they think are the major publications in their discipline, but that cannot be the only question. I want to follow up that question with other ones more specific, and those more specific questions is what's basically structuring my first step, my first approach, my first framework. It's basically 5 things that I want to know. I want to know how research contributions led to some novelties. I want to know what may have been the motivations behind the researchers doing that work. I want to know what kind of influence that work may have had in future works or in any other thing. I want to know if this work may have led to some disciplinary branching, to the creation of a new, approach to doing science. And finally, I also want to know if any work resulted in nothing, in a dead end. That's also pretty important. Science is full of failures. And this, of course, is a good first step. This gives me a template, or more precisely, a guideline for the questionnaire that I will develop later. Although that needs some independent work, and it also gives me a guideline for how to analyze the data that I will collect. Although, of course, that will also require some extra work independently. And that's it. It is simple, but I actually want to emphasize that fact, that I think that at the moment, simplicity is what matters the most. Of course, that has to do with the fact that what I consider most essential in my work is to develop good ways to organize my information, organize the process, organize my analysis, the way in which I'm arriving to conclusions, in a way that's transparent, in a way that's easily understandable for others, in a way that's open. And that's not only for my work. I think that it is becoming increasingly more urgent for researchers to do something like that, to do work that's open to the scrutiny of others. This is a problem in research, in science in general, But I think that it is especially a problem in the qualitative social sciences, in my discipline, because often we see studies in sociology, we see things like developments of new concepts, developments of frameworks, case studies. We see scholars saying a lot of things, coming to a lot of conclusions, but we don't really know what's the process that they follow to arrive at those conclusions. We rarely get to actually see the data that they have used and understand how that data has resulted in those conclusions. A lot of that work happens behind doors. And to be honest, with a lot of confidence, I think that most of that process is bullshit. Sorry, but a lot of qualitative social science is just based kind of on vibes. And beyond having researchers arriving at questionable results, one of the major problems is that this is science, and what we expect is to make progress. We want work to be done by a community. We want our work to lay the foundations for others to improve upon. And it is not possible to do that if the whole process of how we have done research is not open and accessible to others. Again, the process of doing research in science should not be to do studies that are flawless. Our goal should be for our flaws to be transparent, observable, so that others can actually improve upon those. So I want to make my work open as much as I can and transparent as much as I can to as many people as I can. But I will leave it there. Feel free to check my stuff. Feel free to check that little framework that I put together. If it is flawed, I'll be happy if those flaws are obvious.